Welcome back, history scholars. We are looking in this session at some of the impact of the American Revolution, having already talked a little bit about how the revolution came about. Now, this is still not going to be a blow by blow description of all of the military history of the conflict, but it will involve a little bit of um, military talk because I've chosen three legacies of the American Revolution to focus on here. One is going to be the heroics or the making of a hero of George Washington. So that's where we'll get a little bit of military history here. Then we'll also look at another legacy of the American Revolution, and that is that this movement created um, some radical outcomes, some very um, radical changes that come about. We'll look at some of those, especially a radical change in religion and the relationship between religion and government. And finally, we'll look at um, changes that come about in the government, since that's kind of where we're going next anyway. We'll look at how this revolution affected thinking about government. So come with me. Let's talk about three legacies of the American Revolution. For starters, if we are going to talk about one person in the American Revolution, of course, it has to be George Washington, but maybe not for the reasons that you might think. George Washington obviously became a hero in this American Revolution. He's remembered as being the father of this country, of all founding fathers. He's the most fatherly, even though he doesn't have children. Kind of ironic there. But George Washington was important not so much just because of his military genius, but because of other things that he does during the revolution and just afterward. So let's talk a little bit about his role here. George Washington from Virginia, we talked about him, the French and Indian War. Washington was present at the Second Continental Congress when this group, made up of people from all over the colonies, when they decided to declare independence from Great Britain. Washington was part of that assembly, but the role he played was not going to be mainly in the debates over independence or any of that. Washington was chosen at that assembly to be the commander in chief of the armed forces. Now, at that point in the Revolution, the fight was really just taking place in New England. Battles of Lexington and Concord had taken place, and there was the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was really a Massachusetts fight initially. And so, another member of this Second Continental Congress, John Adams, was very wise when he nominated George Washington to take command of this Massachusetts militia and be the commander in chief of this army. Now, that was very wise because John Adams was, in essence, saying the whole Continental Congress, all of the colonies should adopt the Massachusetts militia, adopt those Minutemen as our Continental Army. And he was very wise in saying, let's choose a Virginian. Let's choose someone from the most important colony of all, the richest, the most powerful, the most populated colony. Choose someone from that colony to come and lead the people of Massachusetts. George Washington was a natural choice. He already had some military experience, of course, from the French and Indian War, and he was already dressed for the part. Washington always came to those meetings still in his military regalia from the French and Indian War. It's almost like he was dressing for the part already. So, this is how George Washington becomes commander in chief during the Revolutionary War. And while other leaders still played a role in the Continental Congress, discussing policy or raising money, Washington was leading the army. Now, he struggled in that role, though. He had good success early on. He helped bring in cannons into Boston that could look down upon British ships and be perilous enough that the British Navy decided to evacuate Boston. That was, one great success was Washington's men moving these cannons to really high points through the night that the British were not expecting to see the next morning. But this was not really a retreat. It wasn't as if the British had given up the war and had admitted defeat. They're just relocating to a safer place. Instead of Boston, where this war, the Boston area where the war had really begun, now the British Navy decided to come into New York Harbor and really do some damage. And Washington knew that was most likely the place they were going to go. So he really struggled now in the New York campaign. George Washington and his men lost battle after battle as the British brought in over 30,000 soldiers into lower Manhattan. Now, that was an enormous force there, and it illustrated that the king's forces were serious and they were going to put a crushing smackdown on this American rebellion. So we can't really say Washington was very successful in this New York phase of the fighting. 1776 was not going well for George Washington. The best thing we could say for him is he escapes with a lot of his men. There was a chance for them to be completely trapped and overtaken in the early stages of this New York campaign, and the revolution may have just ended there because this is the main bulk of the forces. But Washington managed to, little by little escape and get most of his men out, at least as they traveled north through New York City, and then escape, heading back south, crossing over the Hudson River and exiting the state altogether. But all of this had been in retreat. Washington had very little success except in escape. His next big success, though, is depicted in this painting, this famous painting here of Washington crossing the Delaware. What is this scene depicting? Well, this was right at the very end of 1776. It's a successful battle that Washington leads, the Battle of Trenton. Trenton, New Jersey, just across the Delaware River that divides New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Washington and his men had been in retreat, but here they surprised the British by crossing over the river, and this is on Christmas Day, so we have other reasons to celebrate on this day. But Washington and his men cross over the Delaware on Christmas Day, 1776, and surprise the British. Really, not just British, but the German mercenaries that they had hired working for them. The British had shown their disdain for the colonists by even hiring mercenaries from various German states to come and fight the Americans. So this was a group of Hessians, a part of Germany. So Washington wins this battle, and that was the best thing that had happened in all of 1776 as far as military success. It was a great symbolic victory, at least, but it certainly doesn't win the war. So Washington had a less than stellar record throughout the war. In fact, the most important victory in the first couple of years of the war was really the Battle of Saratoga. It's not on the slide because it wasn't really part of George Washington's success. Another general named Horatio Gates led the men into victory at Saratoga, New York. That was a much bigger victory than what happened at Trenton, because there the American forces captured this enormous British force of about 5,000 people. And so Saratoga was really significant. It even convinced France that they should join the Americans in an alliance. France can now fight um, for vengeance. They remember what happened to them in the French and Indian War. Battle of Saratoga is really significant, and some even thought Horatio Gates should really be elevated above Washington because he's had the bigger success. Well, Washington does still do um, good things with the military. They certainly grow under his leadership. They get better as a fighting force. And Washington did understand he doesn't have to conquer the British. He just has to be pesky enough that they finally give up. And he was good at doing that, at fighting battles. And even if he doesn't win, still making it damaging enough on the British where they may consider just giving up the fight altogether. But Washington is there at the final victory. Um, the last big battle of the Revolutionary War was in Yorktown, Virginia. And Washington really did um, show some great strategic skill here. Washington had been stationed just outside of New York, where the British had occupied New York, but now he moved his forces down to Virginia and trapped a British army led by um, not Admiral, General Cornwallis. He traps General Cornwallis in Virginia because Cornwallis thought he would be able to meet up with some British ships and escape there, but instead the French Navy had won a naval battle. So there's French boats in the Chesapeake Bay, and there's Washington's men surrounding them at Yorktown. That's the final victory. But even this victory at Yorktown is not really the reason Washington emerges so much as the hero of the revolution. No, the thing that is going to make Washington more legendary than anything else is actually his retirement. You see, there were a number of officers in his army that were fed up with the Continental Congress. That they knew that the Continental Congress owed them money. It had always had trouble supplying them. It had not always really paid them in real money. Sometimes it had just said, here's an IOU. Thank you for your service. Continue to fight. And so there's a number of officers in the military that thought, our Continental Congress has been very ineffective. Government is very slow and um, disorganized. And so some members of the army thought we should take over that Congress, or at least threaten to do so. Threaten that we will take them over and just run this as a military government with George Washington at the head. Now, really, most didn't want to see a military dictatorship, but they were willing to use that threat to make sure the Continental Congress paid them what was owed. But when Washington heard about this plot, this scheme, he wanted nothing to do with it. And in fact, he gives the speech in front of many of his men, his fellow officers, and he takes out these glasses to put on very dramatically. He explains that the war has really um, made him grow old and almost blind because this really has been a long ordeal. He's been at this for several years, um, and so Washington reads this speech, this letter that he's written, explaining that the whole war has been about establishing civilian control of a government, not military control. That it's really the Continental Congress, even if they are ineffective, even if they have had trouble meeting their financial obligations, it would completely undermine the revolution if it resulted in some sort of military dictatorship or making George Washington the new king. So Washington basically through that speech he pours out his emotions. He brings tears to a lot of other officers' eyes who've thought about this plot, who've thought about making this threat. Washington lets them know that's not what we've been fighting for all along. Well, this is a very rare thing indeed for someone who had the opportunity to grab more power personally, and instead they push it aside and decide to just retire. And that's what Washington does. He makes it very clear to his men when the war is over, he's going to go to the Continental Congress. He's going to say, I resign my commission here. Thank you for choosing me as commander in chief. Now I'm going back to Mount Vernon and I'm just a plantation owner again. I'm just a simple farmer. Well, Washington knew the theatrics of this. He knew this will make you legendary. This won't just make you leader of a country for a little while. This is a very rare thing people will be scratching their heads over for generations. King George III, when he even heard about this, he thought, if this is true, if this is not some sort of myth, Washington is a rare person indeed. He may be the greatest man of this generation, because you just don't really see that an individual who has an opportunity to seize power, to walk away from it instead. And of course, it's going to make George Washington the most beloved, most trusted person in all of the colonies. He is going to be the founding father people look to when we have a new government looking for a president. So there's one legacy of the revolution. But another one, and maybe a most overlooked legacy, is the radical nature of this revolution. Now, when you think of other world revolutions in history, they often seem to be quite a bit more radical than the American. What I mean is, the American Revolution is led by some of the elite. George Washington's a very well-to-do plantation owner. So is Thomas Jefferson. Uh, John Adams is not a plantation owner, but he's certainly a well-off lawyer in Massachusetts. The American Revolution is led by many of the elite. Um, Whereas the French Revolution, chops off the heads of many of the elite. It executes a king. Um, the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century also is a very radical movement that ends up getting rid of a czar, executing a monarch. And communist revolution in China is much more radical in 1949. Or we come to the most recent, think of the Iranian revolution, Islamic revolution in Iran, 1979. All of those are obviously very radical because they turn society upside down. The American Revolution doesn't really do that because it's led by many of the elite already. However, there were some things that came from this revolution that were quite radical. One was just a greater sense of democracy and equality. One person that can help illustrate this is someone who was pretty much unknown until a book was written about him a few years ago, named George Robert Twelves Hughes. It's an unusual spelling of the name Hughes, but George Hughes is a good illustration of how radical the revolution was in some ways. Hughes was pretty much unknown because he's not of the elite, um, but he was one of the oldest survivors of the revolution. So he was still around in the 1830s talking about his revolutionary days. He lived almost to 100 years old. And so he could write down, remember what it was like to have gone through the revolution. Well, Hughes was really by trade a simple shoemaker. And he remembered the days in Boston where he was nervous being around other great men. John Hancock, one of the wealthiest people in the colony, a great merchant and leader. John Hancock hired him to repair some shoes or make some shoes for him. And Hughes was nervous. He knew coming into the presence of John Hancock with his giant house, it was intimidating. But that was before the revolution. Hughes also took part in things like the Boston Tea Party and the fights at Lexington and Concord. And He is involved in several engagements of the Revolutionary War, and he started to feel a little different. He as a result of his fighting in the Revolutionary War, he seemed to walk with his head a little higher. He didn't cower in the presence of the well-to-do. He seemed to feel like, I'm the equal of anyone here. I'm an American citizen. What could be higher or more respectable than that? Now, he never became a very wealthy man. He was never considered a gentleman, an aristocrat. But the revolution changed him. He believed anyone who's participated in this revolution can feel a greater sense of equality. Now, that's not exactly what the founding fathers were. That wasn't their whole purpose. They didn't say, we're fighting Great Britain so that everyone can feel equal. That's not the purpose at all. Their talk about equality was much more theoretical, idealistic, um, but as far as social equality, none of them really thought we're going to be leveling all of society where the rich and the poor are all just equal. No, that wasn't really the purpose of the revolution, but it is an outcome, a gradual outcome that many common people started to feel more like they are the equal of anyone else. That's a pretty radical outcome of the revolution. But and a much more important one, and this one's the one, we could spend the whole hour just talking about this, but I'll refrain from doing that. But the most radical outcome of this revolution is really what it does to the relationship between church and state. This revolution creates a greater separation between church and state than had existed before. But it's a bit complicated, so stay with me here, okay? On the slide, you'll notice I have a question mark. Separation of church and state? Well, what do we mean exactly? Well, let's start with the example of Virginia. Virginia, as you probably know, had the Church of England established there from the very beginning with Jamestown. That had always been the official religion, the official church in Virginia. It was official, meaning you paid taxes to it. Whether you were a member of the Anglican Church or not, this was the official church. Now, even just before the Revolutionary War, there were other religious groups that they could get in trouble if someone was preaching and didn't have a license to preach. Baptists, well, they're not going to be executed for preaching Baptist doctrine, but they don't have a license from the state. They could be arrested, and they were. The Anglican Church was the official church. But here's the problem. If we've declared independence from Great Britain, if we've declared independence from England, can we still have the Anglican Church as the official religion, the tax-supported religion? Well, a lot of Virginians thought maybe not. You can't say we reject the king in his political authority, but we still accept him as the head of our church. So Virginia put aside religious establishment for a little while to contemplate this question. And there were a couple of different proposals that came forward in the years ahead. One proposal came from a prominent Virginian named Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry suggested that they should have Christianity generally established in Virginia. This was called the General Assessment Plan. Here's Patrick Henry said, we should still take up a collection, take up a tax, not a collection. The state should still collect a tax to support religion because it was just assumed that government must support religion in some way, financially support. So every country in Europe has an established religion. So of course Virginia is going to have some religion established. They want to encourage morality, especially if they're going to be a free government now. people are going to be very free, then religion is even more essential to keep people in line, to make sure that there's a good moral sense of respect for the law, respect for others' rights. So Patrick Henry, just following that assumption, said, we still want to say this is a Christian country. Virginia is a Christian land, but let's take up a tax and say you may choose which Christian group you want this money to go to. If you're a Baptist, well, we can have your money go to a Baptist church. If you're Presbyterian, it can go to the Presbyterian. If you don't really choose any specific group, then the default will be the Anglican Church, the what now they could call the Episcopal Church. They won't still look to the King of England as the head of this church. They'll have their own American archbishop to be the head of an Episcopal church. Same organization. That was Patrick Henry's general assessment plan. And, for me personally, there's some ways that makes sense. That Virginia still wants to say, we are a Christian state. We're going to do what we can to encourage Christianity. And this tax is going to allow you to choose which particular group you want to support. But there's not an option to just say, I don't support Christianity. I don't support religion. That was just one idea. The counter idea in Virginia came from Thomas Jefferson, and this is the more radical idea. Thomas Jefferson said, let's have no established religion. Let's just don't say anything at all. Let's don't say that Virginia is a Christian state or an Episcopal state. Let's just have no support for religion whatsoever. That was a radical notion because nobody did that in Europe. But Thomas Jefferson was a pretty radical individual. Jefferson believed religion really shouldn't be supported just by government. It shouldn't rely on government for its financial support. People can pay their own contribution to that church if they want to be a member of it, but it shouldn't come from the government. Jefferson thought and this is a really radical notion. Jefferson said that it doesn't make any difference if my neighbor believes in one God, no gods, or 20 gods. It does not make any difference as far as us being neighbors. It doesn't pick my pocket. It doesn't break my leg. That's the wording he used. That was a radical notion to say, it doesn't matter what my neighbor believes religiously, morally. Well, long story short, that's the plan that eventually got adopted. Thomas Jefferson's Bill for Religious Freedom. That's what happened in Virginia. Part of the reason we can't really just give Jefferson credit, there's also his younger friend, James Madison, who picked apart the Patrick Henry plan. He said, and this makes a lot of sense to me too, he said, the problem with Patrick Henry's plan is it makes the state define what is legitimate Christianity. They already had a certain number of groups they could say, okay, we know what Baptists are, that's a Christian group. We know what Presbyterians are, that's a Christian group. We know what the Anglicans or Congregationalists are. But there will be some future groups within Christendom that had not yet been established. And James Madison was saying that the government will always have to define what is legitimate Christianity for the Patrick Henry plan to work. What if I decided, I'm in Virginia in the 1780s, what if I just decide I'm going to give my money to the Church of McCook? We're a small congregation right now. It's really just my family, but we're always looking for new members. But I'm just basically going to keep my tax money to support the church of me. Well, the state obviously should say, that's not a real church. Man, you're trying to cheat the system. That's not supporting religion. But that was James Madison's point. What should the state say about Mormonism, which hadn't started yet. Was that a branch of Christianity? Would that be legitimate? Or, think of any other new movement, new group that's going to be started. And there will be many. So um, James Madison said, we don't want the government in the business of deciding what is legitimate Christianity and what is not. So just have the bill for religious freedom altogether. Well, that was one of Thomas Jefferson's most proud contributions, more so than being president or a lot of other achievements. He wants people to remember him for being the author of the Declaration of Independence, the founder of the University of Virginia, and the author of this bill for religious freedom. Well, that's just Virginia, okay? The relationship between church and state was different in other places, especially in New England. Among the New England colonies, or now states, several still maintained a tax-supported church. So in places like Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, those states still said the Congregational church is the established religion. Your money goes to support those churches. Now, by the 1770s and 80s, people in Massachusetts are not executing Quakers. They're not, flogging Baptists or kicking them out. All those things are long past. But they still did give financial preference, tax support to the congregational churches. And this is even after the revolution, after a constitution goes into effect. The Constitution at the national level, the federal level, it follows more the Virginia plan. Our Constitution doesn't say anything about America being a Christian nation. It doesn't specify any belief system you have to adopt in order to serve in the federal government. But at the state level, those New England states, all of them except for Rhode Island, still said Congregational church gets tax support. And that will go on into the 18 teens in the case of Connecticut and New Hampshire. It goes all the way into the 1830s in the case of Massachusetts. So what really complicates this question, separation of church and state, it doesn't always just come down to tax-supported churches. There's other kinds of establishments, we might say, other state establishments. Um, you know, what I mean is, if a state said, in order for you to be to work in this state government, in order for you to be one of our representatives or to be a governor or any kind of state officer, you must believe in a trinity. Is that an establishment of religion? It's a religious test. It's saying, if you don't believe in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you cannot serve in this government. Well, several states had rules like that, either belief in a Trinity or at least belief in the Christian God. To say you have to believe in a Trinity, that would even eliminate some Christian groups. Certainly eliminates Jews, Muslims, others outside of Christianity. But it was very common for states after the revolution, even after a constitution is passed, it was very common for those states to have these kind of religious rules or these religious tests in order for someone to serve in their state government. One of the most common within various states was the requirement that you believe in a future state of rewards and punishments. It's basically like saying, in order for you to serve the Pennsylvania government, you must believe in a heaven and a hell. Well, why would they do that? Why would they care? Well, there were many people who believed that if someone believes in heaven and hell, then you can at least trust that they will behave themselves in a way, they'll behave themselves in such a way that they know they have to answer for what they do in this life. And we can somewhat trust a person like that. If you don't believe in heaven and hell, if you just think, this life is all there is, and then when it's over, I don't have to answer to anyone for what I did, then we're not so sure we can trust you. We're not sure what kind of abuses you might be worthy of, what kind of abuses you might be willing to do. So, very common rule. Now, not everyone agreed with that kind of rule. There were even some very sincere Christians who would say, how hard is it for a person to just lie about that kind of thing? Sure, I believe in heaven and hell, but they really don't, you know. So then some people would argue, well, you'll then get only liars, who claim that they believe in these things just to pass the religious test and be able to serve in state government. My point is, the relationship between church and state definitely changed after the revolution. Many states still had some type of religious establishment or a religious test to serve in their government. And in New England, they still had tax supported churches. But the trend for the future was what happened in Virginia, this radical step of saying, let's have no establishment of religion whatsoever. Now, some thought that's going to be a terrible thing in the future. Churches will just fall apart without tax support. In fact, just the opposite happens. We'll see that there's a lot of voluntary help, and maybe without reliance on government tax money, people are much more willing to pour forth from their own pocketbooks. So there's legacy number 2. The third legacy has to do with the government, the kind of government that's going to be created as a result of the revolution. This first government of these United States was called the Articles of Confederation. This is the document that ruled the U.S. before there was a constitution. And it had a pretty short life because it really didn't get established until 1781, and it's going to be replaced just a few years later. But I think it's still important to know what the government was like in these, in these few years, less than a decade, under the Articles of Confederation. First of all, we need to understand that this confederation, that just meant a loose connection of these 13 sovereign states. Every state was its own government, but they are drafting articles to say, these are some points we can agree on, and this is what makes us a United States. But it was very difficult to get those 13 states to form this confederation. First of all, because they argue about all these Western lands out here. States like Virginia claim everything that runs to the Mississippi River. And, North Carolina will claim lines just continuing all the way out to the Mississippi River. But some states have no room to grow. Where is Rhode Island supposed to go from here? They can't suddenly, make a claim over here at Lake Michigan. So there's a tension here between states that have room to grow west and states that are locked up against the coast and have nowhere to go. Where's Delaware or New Jersey supposed to go? Some of those smaller states with no room to grow said, we will not form a confederation with you unless you agree this land has to belong to all of us. This land will have to belong to the whole Confederation Congress. It can't belong to just a single state. And that took a long time for them to come to that agreement. Keep in mind, this is the same Continental Congress that's trying to fight a war and raise money. And oh yes, they're writing a document that's going to be the foundation of future government. Oh, let's see here. I did this backwards. I talked about the debate over Western lands. Let me go back to this one here. Another point that slowed down the forming of this confederation was just argument over representation. how many votes does each of these states get in the uh, in the Confederation Congress? Does Virginia get more because they're a larger state? They've got more population, more wealth, or how many does Rhode Island get? Well, here's another point that smaller states said, we will not form a confederation with you if we're going to be unequal partners, if we're going to be almost insignificant and you have all this power and voice in the government. So, in the Articles of Confederation, every state had to agree, every state gets one vote. That's it. It doesn't matter if you send 5 delegates or 3, you could send anywhere from 2 delegates to 7. How many people do you want to buy hotel rooms for? But the vote still just came down to one state, one vote. They're all equal. Now, part of what that should tell us is, part of this legacy is, in the aftermath, and well, really while the revolution is even going on, people want to keep their control of government very local. They don't want distant authority all the way to London. They don't want distant authority anywhere else in the United States. They want to keep power very local, very protective of their own autonomy, their own power from state to state. So, in any kind of government class that you might ever take in high school or college, I'm sure you learn about, in America's federal system, we've got these 3 branches of government: um, the executive, the judicial, the legislative. Well, under the Articles of Confederation, it's quite a bit simpler. There's just one branch of government. It's just the Confederation Congress. There's not an upper house and a lower house. It's no Senate and House of Representatives. No, there's just one group. Articles of Confederation only created a Confederation Congress, and every state there gets one vote. Now, you may hear that there were presidents before George Washington. Technically, no, that there wasn't such thing as an office called President of the United States. What they had was someone that presided over the Confederation Congress. But that person had no special powers. They couldn't veto. They don't get extra vote. They just get the meeting started. They bang the gavel to get things started. They're just another member of the Confederation Congress. Now, by design, people of this revolutionary generation wanted this government to be as limited as possible. It is being formed in order to fight a war in those emergency kind of cases. But otherwise, they wanted the Confederation Congress to be very limited. It had no power to tax. Taxes will be collected locally by states, but here at this federal level, the Articles of Confederation, they do not give Congress the power to tax. No wonder. Well, you'll read about some of the weaknesses of these Articles of Confederation. In the 1780s, we had still terrible time dealing with other nations. If we're not sailing under a British flag along the coast of North Africa, then pirates can see American ships as easy prey. Now this is actually burning because an American snuck back on and burned the American ship instead of letting it fall into pirates' hands. So the burning is actually a victory for the Americans somewhat. But we certainly have problems getting pushed around by other nations because these Articles of Confederation do not create a really strong central government. And economics, boy, these were the bigger problems after the Revolutionary War. Um, there's a lot of inflation in the United States, and governments don't exactly know what to do about it. Should they be really tough on people who are in debt, or should they um, be as lenient as possible? And in fact, by being very lenient to those in debt, they may end up being hard on people who are the creditors, who loaned money or who are owed money. They may never get paid back. Well, Massachusetts was pretty tough on the debtors, And in Massachusetts, people actually started having their farms auctioned off, sold out from under them if they couldn't pay their bills. So a man who fought in the revolution named Daniel Shays decided that was intolerable. He didn't fight in the Revolutionary War in order to later lose his farm because he's in debt. So he thought, I'll do what we did in the revolution. I'll take up arms. I'll fight against this tyranny. Only now, this wasn't tyranny coming from across the ocean. This was a newly elected Massachusetts government. Daniel Shays couldn't say, no taxation without representation. He's represented in the Massachusetts State Assembly. But this so-called Shays Rebellion, this did wake people up. This made a lot of people very concerned that these kinds of rebellions could start happening all over. It could be just like the British said, the Americans will divide into 1,000 tiny little principalities, little warring factions, if they break away from Great Britain. So Shays' rebellion, the main important thing it illustrated was the need for a more centralized government. At least those who wanted a more centralized government, they will look to Shays' rebellion as the example of why we must have a more centralized government. That's what's going to bring about the Constitution, and you'll have to stick around to see how that turns out. So, thank you once again for your attention. That's all for now. Bye bye.